All right, let's talk about electronic voting. Theoretically, this is a election year, and voting technology has definitely been in the news, especially as a response to COVID-19. And so let's ask some question about what electronic voting can do for us and what are the problems involved in electronic voting. First, how do you maintain confidentiality of the people who are voting and who they're choosing to cast their ballots for? Of course, maybe we want to back up and ask, why do we care about that sort of thing? Well, we want to avoid retaliation. If I know that you voted for my worst enemy, then I can more easily take action against you for having voted in that way. We also want to avoid coercion. You can think of this as somebody being forced to cast a ballot for someone that they don't want to. You can think of domestic violence as a good example of this. If I beat up my spouse and force her to vote the way that I want, that's obviously problematic from a democracy standpoint. But it's also problematic in the sense that I can then prove that I'm selling my vote, or I can prove to some purchaser of my vote that I voted in a particular way. And this is problematic for a wide variety of solutions. You can actually think of the second one, coercion and selling of votes, as massively problematic for mail-in voting campaigns, right? If you're able to take your ballot home and then mail it in at any U.S. post office, it's very easy to sell your vote, right? It's very easy for a domestic abuser to force their spouse to vote in a particular way in mail-in voting systems. So there are lots of problems with just voting in democracy that electronic voting has to confront if we're going to actually have an electronic voting mechanism. I've linked some organizations here that talk about the problems of voting in a democracy and how electronic voting makes them worse or may be able to solve some of them. Here in this slide, and I would strongly recommend that you read them if you're interested in this. That said, I am basically just going to give you like the best case scenario, which itself is not necessarily great, of using computers to vote. So step one, you can use a machine that directly records your vote and simultaneously prints out a machine readable record that you then verify immediately. And then once you've got this, you can secure the paper ballots in exactly the same way that you would secure paper ballots in a non-electronic system. And votes could be counted electronically and then potentially verified using the paper ballot system after the fact. This is at least the consensus in the computer science community on what you need to do in order to vote with computers securely and efficiently. Because you get all of the benefits of having an electronic tally, plus all of the benefits of having a paper trail that you can follow for after the vote type mechanisms. Now, there are problems with this, and the problem actually exists in step one. I saw a report recently, an academic publication from J. Alex Halderman at Michigan, basically saying that this step one is problematic, that in practice, people do not actually verify their votes immediately after they've cast the ballot. So if you had compromised one of these electronic voting machines, that's so-called a direct recording electronic voting machine, or pardon me, not a direct recording voting machine. What's the acronym? I don't remember the acronym, but the machines that actually print the ballot that you then verify, and then the printed version is the one that actually counts as your vote. People don't look at them, even though they're printed immediately as you're casting the vote. They just don't verify them. Or if they do, they don't see errors in them at the same rate. And this is obviously problematic with even bothering to use computers in the voting process at all. And there are book-length versions of some of the problems with these sorts of issues. You can kind of think of this as a book-length summary arguing why the previous slide is the best approach that we can do for using computers to vote. I actually very much like this book. I think it's still 100% relevant because almost nothing has changed in the voting industry, or at least the electronics and voting industry. And then I would also recommend this book. This was published a few years later, 2012. It's a little bit more academic and it's certainly more expensive, but you may be able to find it in the UMBC library. And it's still very similar to a lot of earlier work in this area. But it's maybe the best, most comprehensive approach to all of the problems with electronic voting systems as they are currently used today. And there, of course, will be other pieces that, and going all the way back to this slide here, this is January 2020 testimony. I think we're going to continue to see congressional hearings about what electronic security systems we need in place for voting, and what are the problems with all of the various approaches that we could take to voting for many, many years to come. It's a very challenging, extremely difficult problem to solve with computers, and there's lots and lots of pressure to find a solution using a computer to do it more efficiently, more effectively. So this is not going away. It's another very hot topic that you should focus on if you're interested in information systems. Okay, a few more things, a few additional technologies and privacy issues that I wanted to cover, simply because they're in the textbook. The first is voice over IP. The textbook coverage of this topic feels a little bit old, but basically they're talking about Skype, they're talking about Google Hangouts or Google Meet, they're talking about Zoom and so forth. The features that we want for the system are things like end-to-end encryption, but also CALIA access. And CALIA is the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. It's very difficult to get both of those at the same time, and we should talk a little bit about why that is the case. So CALIA covers both voice messaging, like the services we were just talking about previously, voice over IP services, as well as text messaging, because it happens on a telecommunication line, right? Essentially, AT&T is handling text messages rather than your ISP. And there's two different levels that law enforcement can get access to these communications. The first is the so-called trap and trace method. That's essentially just getting access to metadata about the communication. For example, who are the people involved in the communication? When did it take place? How long was it? Where was it? That sort of stuff. And then under Title III, you can get not just that metadata, but also the actual content of the communication. For example, what was the message in the text message? Or what was the recording of the conversation as it was happening over the phone? Now, this basic regime has been in place for a very long time, and it's the main reason why voice over IP services, especially fully end-to-end encrypted services, are so disruptive for police forces, so disruptive for law enforcement services, because the whole legal system is sort of geared around the notion that we have access, that law enforcement has access under a regime similar to this with these two different levels of access. And if you have truly fully encrypted services, that isn't possible anymore, right? So there's a fundamental tension here that is not going to disappear, that is very similar to the electronic voting problem in the sense that it is, you can't have both at the same time, and any attempt to add in something like a trap and trace mechanism or a Title III mechanism to an end-to-end encrypted service necessarily weakens the encryption for that service. It's a fundamental trade-off that's just very, very difficult to get past in policy debates. So another really, really critical consideration for security and privacy. All right, so let's summarize this lecture based on everything that we've talked about thus far. Essentially, we want to know what privacy is. We want to come up with a good definition of privacy and what data is considered private. And we've learned that this is just a subjective problem, that everybody has their own definition and everybody has their own set of data that they consider to be particularly sensitive. That makes it much more difficult than security. In a security context, it's much easier to come to agreement on what matters and what doesn't. Another important challenge with privacy is that privacy laws vary widely by jurisdiction. Even in the United States at the state level, there are lots and lots of variations on what counts and what doesn't, what's private and what's not. But when you get to the international level, it is even worse. There's much more jurisdictions that are interested in protecting privacy in a variety of different ways. We talked about some of the technologies involved, including tracking technologies like cookies, web bugs, and spyware. All of these are going to be ongoing concerns for at least the next 5 to 10 years, and probably much longer than that. Email, by default, has almost no privacy protections because it's a very old protocol, and much of the service is not encrypted. This is going to be an ongoing challenge as well, simply because email is not going away. It is basically unkillable. There's no way to get rid of email. It's the bootstrapping service for your account on basically every web service that you sign up for, and so we're just going to be stuck with this problem for quite some time. And then emergent technologies that are causing additional privacy concerns, privacy concerns and legal concerns, are just going to continue to pop up over time. It is not the kind of thing that disappears simply because technology gets better. If anything, it's the kind of thing that gets worse because technology covers more and more of our lives. So that's basically everything I wanted to say about privacy. I will see if I can get these online as soon as possible. And then if you have questions, please contact me either during office hours or by email or on the discussion boards on Blackboard.